This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I want to take the time to thank all of you for your support since I've started this podcast, and I want to thank those who've subscribed to my Piano Maven Substack page, where you will find a link to it in our episode description. And you can subscribe for free, although paid subscribers get extra goodies, such as monthly downloads and also links to Zoom Hangout meetings. So thank you for considering a subscription. I'm not going to discuss recordings, actually, on today's episode, but I am going to talk about pianists, specifically the topic of cult pianists. My friend David Hurwitz has been on a recent roll doing a series of videos that presents lists on the topic of conductors, like cult conductors or annoying conductors or underrated conductors, whatever. And he did a video on cult conductors, and also he posted reviews a while back on classicstoday.com in a cult conductors series that didn't go on all that long. I wish it would expand a bit. But I thought I would imitate David Hurwitz, as I often do. And I'm going to come up with a list. Actually, I did come up with a list. Why am I saying that in the present? I did that in the past. I wrote out the list. It's a list of 10 pianists that I call cult pianists. And I'm sure this will instigate a healthy discussion among fellow piano mavens. Just what is a cult pianist, you may ask? Well, a cult pianist can mean several things. It can mean a pianist who may not be the most popular pianist on the planet, yet this pianist still amasses a devoted following and exerts a strong influence in the piano world. Or else a cult pianist can be one who cultivates a certain persona or mystery, or one who has a mercurial temperament or an unpredictable temperament. Some cult pianists think that the cult that materializes around them is nonsense, yet other cult pianists encourage such behavior among their admirers. And then there are some pianists who only achieve cult status after their death or their retirement. And one example of that kind of pianist happens to be the first one on my list. I think this is a good example of a pianist who really acquired his cult status after he retired and after he died, but not necessarily when he was alive. And this is Josef Hofmann, who lived from 1876 until 1957. He was one of the most popular and admired and respected pianists of his time. And he was considered something of a modernist in terms of his largely straightforward and technically breathtaking pianism. His studio recordings tended to be much straighter and direct in comparison with the flippant phrasing and variety of tricks that one often finds in his live performances from the late 1930s onward. Now, what happened with Josef Hofmann is that after he died, he was pretty much forgotten about, except in the late 1960s, reissues of his broadcasts started to materialize along with the commercial recordings, and these mostly came from the International Piano Archive. And these reissues generated a lot of curiosity among piano specialists, and they began seeking these reissues out and also starting to wonder about, what other Josef Hofmann material is out there. And then starting in the 1990s, a complete edition of Josef Hofmann's recordings began to appear on CD, first on the VAI label, and then the Marston label took over the series. And The end result was 9 volumes of the complete Josef Hofmann. And I think that the cult of Hofmann really was developed in tandem with these reissues, with people becoming interested in looking for more Hofmann performances and a lot of new discoveries coming out. So in that sense, Hofmann's cult status came after his death. The second cult pianist on my list is Artur Schnabel. Now, it was true that he was popular in his time, and he did enjoy an international reputation. He was a major, major player and had tremendous respect among his colleagues. He had a measurable influence on 20th century pianism in terms of attitudes toward programming, along with his analytical approach to interpretation, his close scrutiny of the text. In other words, his influence on the interpretive mainstream of the 20th century was considerable. But I still consider him a cult pianist in the sense that he taught many pupils who carried on his ideas, sometimes to more fundamentalist extremes than Schnabel. In other words, they were more Schnabel than Schnabel. I don't think Schnabel dissuaded this entirely, but there was a quote I read somewhere when Schnabel complained that he had been cursed by his pupils. I think there was a pupil who said, "Oh, Chopin is only a salon composer. Didn't you say that, maestro?" And Schnabel said, "I only said he was a salon composer at times." I don't remember the exact quote. The third cult pianist on my list is Mieczyslaw Horszowski, who lived from 1892 until 1993. It's rumored that he may have been older than 100 when he died. And like Artur Schnabel, he studied, too, with Fyodor Leschetizky. And also, like Schnabel, he played a wide variety of repertoire in solo concerts in the early part of his career. But starting more or less in the 1940s, he was playing chamber music on an equal footing to his solo playing. And he didn't stop playing solo concerts, but he was heard more and more frequently in collaborative projects. And he was becoming more and more known for the central German Austro repertoire, although he did play some Chopin, he played a little Debussy, Szymanowski. And once Horszowski entered his 90s, a coterie of young and internationally acclaimed pianists like Andras Schiff and Richard Good and Peter Serkin, along with others, really started to advocate a lot on Horszowski's behalf, and they convinced the powers that be at Nonsuch Records to preserve Horszowski's solo artistry. And so he began to make some solo recordings in the familiar setting of the Curtis Institute, where he taught. And a series of solo releases were issued on Nonsuch over period of years. I think there were about 5 CDs. And then you suddenly had critics turning out for his New York recitals and fawning over him. And my late friend Alan Evans began issuing recordings deriving from Horszowski's concerts from the 1950s up through the 1980s. He issued a performance of the Beethoven Diabelli variations that Horszowski gave when he was 90, I think. So in a way, Horszowski was a pianist who I think enjoyed the limelight, but he didn't pursue it. And you kind of get the idea of this old man playing for himself and just reflecting on his experience with this repertoire, and that everyone coming to the concerts or listening to the recordings was eavesdropping and trying to get his wisdom. So I guess in a sense, he's a cult pianist. Vladimir Sofronitsky was a Russian pianist who lived from 1901 until 1962. He is definitely a cult pianist. He had a pretty big repertoire, but he mainly specialized in Scriabin. He never met Scriabin, but he did wind up marrying Scriabin's daughter. And In Sofronitsky's heyday, he almost had a kind of rock star kind of following in the Soviet Union. There always seemed to be a mystical aura about his many concerts at the Moscow Conservatory and the Scriabin Museum, where he loved to play. He did not like making studio recordings very much, although his studio discography is considerable. Yet many of Sofronitsky's concerts were recorded live, and I think generally without his knowledge. Now, despite the kind of cult following he had in Russia, Sofronitsky's reputation in the West was rather shadowy for the simple reason that his recordings rarely were made available in the West in the 50s and 60s. However, all of that started to change in the late 1970s when the Russian Melodia label started bringing out box sets of LPs devoted to Sofronitsky that not only contained studio recordings, but numerous live performances of the kind I was talking about from the Moscow Conservatory and the Scriabin Museum and other venues. And this was supposed to be a complete, or quote-unquote complete Sofronitsky edition, but the Melodia boxes never went beyond a certain number of volumes. Anyway, specialist collectors like me got all worked up over the Sofronitsky boxes, which could only be found in imports at stores like Four Continents in New York and later at the Tower Records branch on East 4th Street, I think, if you could find these at all. The problem is that many of these concerts were preserved in mediocre sound with harsh and sometimes distorted piano reproduction, and it's sometimes difficult to listen through or get past the sonic muck. And, many of the Scriabin Museum concerts that were issued suffered from the absence of a good piano tuner. So one has to sift through the Sofronitsky discography to find the best material in terms of both performance and sound quality. Actually, sometimes I like the idea of Sofronitsky more than the reality. Maybe the aura that he cast over audiences didn't always translate well into the recording media. But there are a lot of wonderful performances, but you just have to look for them. At a certain point, I should do a Sofronitsky episode for the Piano Maven, but he definitely had a cult around him, and I think even with the recordings coming out and people chasing after them, those Melodia box sets, that's a cult for you, I think. Another Russian pianist who had a hypnotic effect on his audiences, but enjoyed a truly international career once he began touring in the West, was Sviatoslav Richter. He lived from 1915 until 1997. Western music lovers had a good inkling of Richter's gifts through his recordings from the 1950s, and I think it was that live 1958 Sofia, Bulgaria performance of Mussorgsky's Pictures and Exhibition that got a lot of attention and made Richter's name sort of a household word before he made his first appearances in the West. And then when Richter first toured in the West in 1960, all of the record companies jumped on the Richter bandwagon. However, as prolific as Richter was on disc and in concert, he never was comfortable in the limelight, and he could be moody and unpredictable, although never less than totally professional. But in Richter's case, I think the cult aspect of his career has less to do with the pianism per se than with the fascination of his highly devoted, even fanatical fan base. There were people who followed Richter around from concert to concert, and a great number of live recordings started to turn up on all kinds of labels. There was an organization called the Friends of Sviatoslav Richter that was devoted to making cassettes available of various Richter concerts. often in search of repertoire that he didn't record in the studio or was not otherwise available commercially. So, in this regard, I've always thought of Richter as being the Grateful Dead of pianists, with people following him around. And, I don't think he had an official taper section, but, there were so many Richter bootlegs out there. And, the whole Richter discography is a mess. I've talked about the Richter discography on this podcast before. The next one on my cult pianist list is Rosalyn Tureck. And this is a case of someone cultivating her own cult as a Bach specialist. By the early 1950s, the main focus of Rosalyn Tureck's concerts and recordings was the music of J.S. Bach, with a few exceptions. And the intense focus and specificity and utter concentration informing her approach to Bach and her total seriousness of purpose cannot be denied. And people generally went to her concerts not so much to listen as to worship. I'm not sure who first called Rosalyn Tureck the high priestess of Bach, although I remember once I wrote a review saying, well, the high priestess ought to get out of the temple more often. I think David Hurwitz wrote that also, and I just stole that from David. A pianist who is very similar to Rosalyn Tureck in terms of refined precision, and this may surprise you to hear me say that, is Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli. Now, he is a case where the cult surrounding him has more to do with value and scarcity, because Michelangeli was notorious for canceling concerts, and I'd like to say that he canceled more concerts than he played. He probably had the smallest public repertoire of any international concert pianist. The same works tended to pop up on his concerts over and over again between the early 50s and his last concert in 1993. You'd get the same few Beethoven sonatas or Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, Debussy's Image and Children's Corner, the Preludes Book 1, certain Chopin pieces he would play all the time. You always got the Brahms Paganini variations and the Bach Busoni Chaconne. And in the years after his death, piano mavens have searched high and low looking for previously unknown live recordings to supplant Michelangeli's relatively small output of official studio recordings. And, I've done several podcasts on Michelangeli box sets, and you do see like 4 or 5 different versions of the Bach Busoni Chaconne, and piano mavens tend to analyze these thinking, oh yeah, well, the 1948 commercial recording is good, but there's the live one from 1958 or 2086, and the one he played on Mars is much better than the one he played on Venus. And, well, you know what I mean. But definitely there was a cult around him. I would say also that Martha Argerich is a cult pianist because she's in a position to pick and choose what she plays, who she plays with, and where she plays. And she tends to do the same concertos and chamber works over and over again, but with different collaborators. And with few exceptions, she's avoided playing solo music in public since 1983. But all musicians love her, it seems. And a simple announcement that Argerich is going to be giving a concert creates a box office stampede. And another mercurial piano luminary who has become more and more of a cult figure these days is Grigory Sokolov. He avoids certain countries and he doesn't make studio recordings anymore, and he has a similarly strong performing personality and sense of projection that relates to Martha Argerich and Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli. And you may or may not like his interpretations, But the finish of his pianism and his almost scientific understanding of the piano's capabilities is something that you really can't ignore. And I know many, many pianists who consider Sokolov a kind of a god, even when he does outrageous interpretive things. And he has that kind of mythic status that's similar to Michelangeli and Argerich. And I don't think he started out as a cult pianist, certainly not when he won the Tchaikovsky competition when he was 16, I think in 1966. But I would say that starting in the 1990s, the cult started manifesting itself. And the last pianist on my list, and I think you knew this was coming, this is a pianist who definitely cultivated his own cult, his own persona, and his own myth. I'm talking about Glenn Gould. I wouldn't say so much cultivated than calculated, maybe. Calculated is the right word, because calculation was so much a part of his persona and artistic aesthetic. And he really knew how to draw attention to himself. Think about wearing winter clothes in the summer weather, his unusually low seating position, and his crazy homemade bench, his humming along and gesticulating, and more importantly, his deliberately individual and very provocative interpretations. And also his very public renunciation of playing in public in order to devote himself exclusively to studio recording. But Glenn Gould did have the pianistic brilliance and the musical mind to bring off anything he desired, and he did this with such charisma, of course. And you have to think of this, more than 40 years after his untimely death at the age of 50, Gould is still talked about and listened to very intensively. His recordings are reissued ad infinitum. More books have been written about Glenn Gould than of any other classical pianist, and he is still a very polarizing figure. Conservative musicians can't abide him, yet even some of his most wrong-headed and deliberately provocative interpretations are such fun to listen to, like his Mozart, for example. That's one of my guilty pleasures. I mean, I feel awful for saying that, but as crazy as his Mozart can be, I think what I like about it is that there isn't any cliche about the craziness. It's crazy and original. And yet, some of Glenn Gould's quote-unquote normal performances are beautiful beyond belief. Think about some of his Brahms intermezzos, his Beethoven Third Concerto, a lot of his Bach, of course, his Schoenberg Concerto, his Berg Sonata. So there you go. That is a cult pianist if there ever was one. And we've been talking about 10 cult pianists. Who else would you like to add to this list? Who did I forget to put on this list? I'm sure there's so many other pianists that belong here. Let me know, and let's start a conversation on this topic. It'll be a lot of fun. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. And I look forward to being with you for the next episode.